Hey guys, what's up? It's John from Japanese Knife Imports, and I have a long overdue Ask Me Anything from Reddit. I promised these guys a little while back that they could ask me a bunch of questions and I would get around to answering them, and then of course life and work got in the way. So here we are today. I have a whole list of questions right here, and we're going to try and get through them as quickly as we can. So here we go. The first question is, what are some common sharpening mistakes that you can see new and seasoned sharpeners make, and how do you correct those mistakes? There's a lot, I guess. I think that angle inconsistency is probably one of the biggest things that people struggle with, and that's a pretty easy one to fix. Pretty much you just need to color in the knife with Sharpie and see what's going on. We have a cool little image. If you guys ever are interested, we can email it to you or I can post it somewhere online. But it goes through what the different mistakes are that you can make and how they look in Sharpie. So for example, you'll see like angle too low, angle too high, under rotation, over rotation, not lifting up enough, and lifting up too much. And you can see all of them because they show up in different patterns in Sharpie. And I think that that's one of the easiest things to fix for people because you get high contrast visual instant feedback when you use this kind of method. I guess another one that I see a lot of people do is over refining the edge, where they sharpen too high in grit and they get an edge that's really sharp when it comes to shaving arm hair or cutting paper, but it doesn't really work well for food. And I think that it's important to keep in mind what kinds of grits are appropriate for the kinds of tasks you're looking to do. So if you're cutting a lot of thick-skinned vegetables, having something that's a little bit toothier tends to work a little bit better. For butchery, also having that tactile feedback seems to work out pretty well. And sometimes you want a little bit more refined edge when you're cutting raw fish or vegetables that are going to be plated raw on a plate. But figuring out that and what kind of balance will work well for you without going over the top is another one. And I guess the last one that I see a lot on single bevel knives is a tendency for people to make edges totally flat, bevels totally flat. And it's not necessarily that this is wrong. There's a style of sharpening where that's totally correct. But I think that there are some significant sacrifices that you make when you do that kind of sharpening, specifically with regard to food release and how brittle the edge is going to be. And so I tend to recommend and prefer what's called a hamaguri edge, which is a kind of compound bevel that I've explained in a number of sharpening videos, but the gist of it is that it promotes a little bit better food release and the edge is a little bit more tough and durable when you sharpen that way. So I think those are probably the most common mistakes that I see people make. There's a lot, not flattening your stones as often as you should. I think a lot of people want to get away with not flattening quite as much, and you can. It's not the end of the world, but it's tough to get the best results when you're not taking care of those kinds of things. So I think that's going to be my answer for that one. Let's see what we can do for our next one. So what suggestions would you give someone looking to choose between a laser or a workhorse? So a laser describes a knife that's extremely thin, both at the spine and through the entire kind of cross-sectional geometry, also behind the edge, whereas a workhorse can be a few different things. For example, a workhorse could be something that's a lot softer, that makes it a little bit more tough and durable. Where you don't see as much chipping. A workhorse could also be something that's a little bit thicker and heavier, but it might not be quite as soft. And so there's some different kind of opinions on what constitutes a workhorse. A lot of it really depends on, I guess, your style of cutting. If you're a finesse-oriented person or you're working with a lot of hard vegetables, I tend to prefer thin knives. And that's a lot is my personal preference with respect to that, but I think that thinner knives move through those foods with a lot less resistance and a lot less force required, whereas the thicker knives, even though they may be less prone to damage, they're more likely to wedge, the foods are more likely to crack or break along the way. So the cuts don't complete, but rather you get like part way through and then you'll hear a cracking sound and the bottom of the cut will look a little bit messed up. That being said, if you want something where you don't have to worry about it quite as much, where it's just going to be a beast for you in the kitchen, a workhorse is going to be more your style. They'll tend to have a little bit better food release. Whereas the thinner knives will move through foods a lot more easily, so you get a little bit more finesse-oriented cutting and cuts complete a little bit more easily, but foods stick a little bit more to the sides and they can be a little bit more fragile or brittle, and so you'll have to figure out again for you what works well. For me, I've always preferred the thinnest knives I can find. I just like the way they cut. It's my personal preference. Not everyone's going to agree with it, and that's why there's a lot of knives out there. So, yeah. All right, the next one says, John, would you care to give a brief overview of the regional differences of knives made in Japan? Sure, can do that. There are a few different regions that you'll see knives made in Japan. I think some of the bigger ones that people know about would be like Seki in Gifu Prefecture, Sanjo in Niigata, Sakai in Osaka, and probably the Tosuyamada region in Shikoku in Kochi Prefecture. And they all have different kind of historical I guess, developmental histories of how knives became in that area, how they came to be in that area. So like, for example, in the Tosa region, their history is in forestry tools and axes, hatchets, stuff like that. But also a lot of fishermen are down there, and so you'll see things that are appropriate for being on boats and don't require quite as much care or attention, but can be more of like workhorse style knives. In Sanjo, there's a history in woodworking tools like planes and chisels, and also kind of different cultural history in terms of how companies work there. In Sakai, the history was in tobacco knives. In Seki, the history was in large-scale commercial sword production a long time ago, so not in the way that we think of commercial production today, but more than just, you know, one by an artist kind of thing, where they were trying to make lots of swords so that they could stock up on swords for their military pretty quickly. Nowadays, all of the cities kind of operate in different ways. A system that you'll see a lot in Japan is called the Bungyo system, which is kind of like a citywide assembly line where multiple companies from one city are involved in the production of a knife. Sakai is pretty famous for that, and so in Sakai you'll see, for example, the blacksmith that does the forging, the sharpener that does the sharpening, the handle maker, the saya maker, and what's called a tonya, the company that kind of puts that all together and arranges the parts and pieces so that they come together in an effective way. That's the way this stuff is done in Sakai. Most often there's a couple of exceptions to that where some companies do a lot more in-house, but in general you'll see that kind of separation of work, which allows for really great specialization. So there's blacksmiths that are really awesome at blacksmithing and sharpeners that are really awesome at sharpening. But because they're not doing everything all in the same place, sometimes they don't have that overarching view that you might see in other regions, like Sanjo, for example. In Sanjo, things are done predominantly in one place. And so you'll see all the grinding, forging, heat treating, everything except for the handle and saya making done in one place. And because of that, the craftsmen tend to have a better overarching view of how things work together, but they don't have the same kind of specialization that you'll see in a place like Sakai. Also, I guess the way that people use tools is a little bit different. So for example, in Sanjo, people use spring hammers a little bit more, the same in Fukui and Echizen. But in Sakai, they use belt hammers that move a little bit faster but don't hit quite as hard. In Seki, the Bungyo system is a little bit stronger. You see a lot of different companies involved. So there will be like a rough grinding company, a laser cutting company that might cut out shapes, different heat treating companies and cryogenic treating companies, and split up in a lot more parts. And so there can be, you know, 10 or 20 companies involved in the production of one knife in Seki. And that kind of goes back to their more factory production style of making things there. Which is not to say that there isn't hand labor. There's a lot of hand labor that goes into that kind of stuff as well. And so when you walk into these factories, I think people are expecting to see a lot of automated processes, but in reality, it's just dudes making things in just higher quantities. In Echizen, they have a history also in kind of like woodworking stuff and what do they call them? Like kama for like farming tools. They kind of fit somewhere in between what Seki looks like and what Sanjo looks like, in the sense that there are craftsmen that are specializing in hand making things, but they're doing them in a little bit larger quantity than what you'll see in a workshop in Sanjo, for example. And so those are, I guess, some of the major knife making regions that you'll see. There are also, you know, small makers in regions that aren't quite as popular for knife making. But they're a little bit less common, and the style that they do things might depend on where that guy trained or girl. I guess there's some female blacksmiths and blade makers in Japan as well nowadays. So hopefully that gives you a brief overview of different regions in Japan and how they're making stuff and how they came to be making those things. So next, I'd be interested in market development. What changes has the industry gone through since you started importing knives, and what do you expect over the next 10 years in terms of supply and demand or hype? It's always changing. I think maybe when I first started cooking, which was quite some time ago now, Mac knives and global knives were like the main thing that people saw, and those were the first kind of entree to Japanese knives for many people in the US. And since that time, people have gotten a lot more into craft knives, handmade knives, where it's like sole authorship, and they get into the story of who's making things, and so people want to know about who the blacksmith was and who the sharpener was and what their pedigree was a lot more now. There have also been changes in terms of what people like. I've always liked really thin knives, and I think that those were popular about 10 years ago, maybe around that time. People started getting into what they would call lasers, So you would see, for example, like our Geshin Ginga line or the Suisun Inoxon Yaki, Ikanashi Tadatsuna. There were a number of really, really thin knives that were very popular. And in recent years, those have kind of fallen off in favor of, I guess, more like Sanjo style knives, where they have more pronounced distal taper and they're a little bit more of like a workhorse style grind, like a medium thickness blade. They have a little bit more weight to them. They tend to have better food release, and oftentimes the heat treatments are a lot harder nowadays, and people seem to be enjoying that. They don't mind the brittleness, but they don't like how light the lasers are, and they want that kind of food release. And I think even more than performance of the knife, people are paying attention to like the story behind it, the pedigree of the craftsman, or how compelling the story is of who makes what nowadays. And I feel like that's where the market seems to be going right now, which I think I suck at following because I kind of just do what I like to do, and I tend to sell things that I enjoy using, which severely colors the way that we order things. That's not to say that we don't have stuff like that. For example, like the Kochi series that we have, I think fits in really well for what people are into right now. I don't know where it's going to go from here. I think there's going to be some interesting things going on. There's going to be a gap in the skill level of craftsmen because there was a kind of lull in demand for a long time in Japan. There was a time where a lot of people didn't have apprentices and they weren't able to train new people. And they're just starting to see that there's a lot more money involved now. There's a lot of demand in foreign markets. And so people are taking on apprentices and younger craftsmen are getting into it. I'm not sure how that's going to play out, but it is interesting to see that there's a lot more youth involved in the production of Japanese knives nowadays. And the major demand is actually from foreign markets, not domestic markets within Japan. Domestically, people just aren't into this kind of stuff in the same way they once were, but foreign markets seem to be extremely into it. I wonder how much factory production will fall off. It seems like there's not as much demand for those kinds of things, and it feels like China is kind of taking over a lot of that style of production. But again, those are the kinds of things that people that aren't crazy dorky about knives will always be into because they work well and they're easy and they're affordable and accessible, versus these kind of one-by-one handmade super high-end knives that would work well for people that are crazy dorky about knives, but probably not for like your average cook that's trying to just get something that works well for their day-to-day work environment. So hopefully that answers your question. Here we go. Next one is, what is the most important thing you aim for or keep in mind while doing heavy thinning, where you essentially overhaul a knife's geometry or completely change how it cuts? I like thin things, and so as I'm going through, I want to make sure that my grind is consistent. I'm not trying to introduce additional high or low spots as I go through this kind of thing. And I don't want to overly flatten the sides of the knives. I like to keep some kind of convexivity there so it promotes a little bit better food release and isn't quite as brittle. But I think the biggest thing that I think about is that I want to go as thin as I can for what I think will work for that knife, that steel, that heat treatment, and of course the end user. If I know that person's going to be super, super rough on their knives, I'm not going to go as thin as I would for someone that I know is going to be really finesse oriented and delicate and understand the care and maintenance of their knives. But I think getting thin enough is the biggest part of it. And I also feel like when people do thinning, they often don't thin high up on the knife quite enough. Not to say like at the spine, but a lot of people think of thinning as just maybe like rounding off the shoulders of the bevel or just a little bit in that area. And I think when I thin, I'm usually like 1/3 or halfway up the blade in terms of really affecting change of cross-sectional geometry. And so I try and keep those kinds of things in mind. I want to make sure that when I'm working on clad knives specifically, that I get a somewhat even grind on both sides, where I'm keeping the core steel somewhat centered, so I'm not shifting the apex of the edge off to one side or the other in any significant way, because that can cause problems over time. And I guess that's about it that I really think about. I like this next question. What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? Clearly that's 11 meters per second, and I hope that you guys watch Monty Python. All right, let's see this next one. Do you think you could give us a video demo of putting a hamaguri edge on a double bevel, wide bevel knife sometime in the near future, or is it just going to be pretty much the same as what I do in the single bevel knives? I can try and make a video. Clearly, we're not so great at making videos in a pretty frequent manner, but I don't see why that would be so difficult to do. It is really similar to what we do for single bevel knives. And I think when people hear me talk about Hamaguri, they have this idea that the bevels are going to be really different from one another. But in reality, the angle change is really not that significant, and it's more a function of where I place pressure with my fingers and how I place that pressure that allows me to control that angle change. And I feel like if you're seeing a significant angle change where you'll see the spine kind of raise up or lower down visibly in a significant manner when you're doing this kind of thing, you're probably overdoing it. And I don't think that that's the best for the cross-sectional geometry of the knife. So I'll try to make a video on it at some point, but in the meantime, just try not to overdo the angle change as you go through that kind of stuff. So what's next here? I struggle with maintaining a consistent angle while sharpening and feeling whether I'm sharpening the edge. This is harder for me to sense when I use finer stones than 1000 grit. Do you have any pointers for maintaining the angle or feeling that angle? A lot of it comes from practice and muscle memory, but as I talked about earlier, using Sharpie, coloring in your blade, will really help you out with that because it gives you a visual feedback instead of tactile feedback. When you're sharpening, you're relying a lot on your senses. You want to hear how things sound, you want to feel how they feel, you definitely want to look at things as much as you can. Obviously taste isn't going to be involved, but when you're sharpening natural stones, they do smell awesome. I think the Sharpie is probably the best tool in terms of maintaining angle consistency and doing it often. You know, so you'll dry off your knife because Sharpie and water don't mix well, and you'll color it in with a bunch of Sharpie, not just the bevel, but some area behind the bevel as well. So you get like a ½ inch of Sharpie, just thick along the edge. Let it dry and then start sharpening. And when the Sharpie gets removed and you can't see what's going on anymore, stop and dry it off and color it in again. When it comes to angle too high, for example, when your spine is too high relative to the stone, you'll see that just the Sharpie at the very edge of the bevel gets removed, but not the area behind that covering the rest of the bevel. And so in that case, you want to lower the spine a little bit. And when your angle is too low, you'll see that the edge remains black, but the area behind it becomes shiny. And in that case, you want to raise the spine up a little bit. And as long as you can be cognizant of those kinds of things, I think it's pretty straightforward in terms of developing that kind of angle consistency. But in reality, it just comes from a lot of practice and trying to get comfortable with it. I know that it's also a little bit more difficult to feel a burr at those higher grits, and some of that just comes down to how you do it. A lot of people like to use their thumb, but the thumbs are a lot less sensitive than their index fingers or middle fingers would be. And so I always recommend that you use your index fingers and middle fingers to feel for the burr as much as you can. They're a lot more sensitive. There are other indicators that you should be looking for when you're sharpening and refining stuff. So for example, like scratch patterns you want to pay attention to, but really a lot of it just comes from practice and doing it over and over and over again until you feel comfortable with it. And if you find that you're not getting good results at the end, then stop and start over and see what's going wrong, where you feel like you're not getting those results or where things start to go wrong. So just test a little bit more frequently as you go through your sharpening process. Bug me anytime you guys have questions with stuff like that also. So if you see something, you just take pictures of it and email me or come into the store, and I'm happy to help you out with that kind of stuff. All right, let's see what we have. Is there a good standard measurement that can at least loosely define a laser versus a workhorse? So for example, something like measuring the thickness of a blade 5 millimeters up from the edge or anything like that. Not exactly. Because I think there are a lot of different things that can define a workhorse. So for example, you could have a thin knife where the heat treatment is geared towards being a lot more tough and durable, or where the steel isn't quite as hard, and that could be more of a workhorse. Or you could have a really thick knife that you might think of as a workhorse, but it could be really hard and brittle. And so it really depends on what you're thinking a workhorse would be. In my mind, a workhorse has always been something that's been on the more tough and durable side of things. And whether that's thicker or thinner really doesn't matter that much to me. You don't really see a lot of super thin workhorses. But not any particularly clear metric, because I don't feel like people have a consistent definition of what it is for themselves. Some people, again, like just things that are thicker, and they don't mind if they're extremely hard or brittle. And to me, that wouldn't be a workhorse. It would just be like a medium thickness knife or a thick knife. But I think people would call that a workhorse nowadays. It's a confusing subject. I wish I had a better answer for that one. All right. Hey, John, can you go into detail about natural stones, all the different kinds, maintenance, how to use them, and why they can cost $100 and up to $2,000? They actually sometimes can cost quite a bit more than that. I think that's a really complicated subject, and I can get into it a lot. There are some good resources online that are already up and available for that kind of thing that talk about the different strata. Natural stones are a little bit tricky. Even a stone that you like might change over time. So with synthetic stones, for example, you have like a binding agent and an abrasive that come together and they're mixed together and set and fired. And that's what you have as your stone. But with natural stones, there's no separate binding agent or abrasive. It's just a rock, you know. And so, for example, with the Japanese natural stones, the high silica content is what helps them be abrasive. But there are other things going on in the stone that also affect the way that the stone sharpens, how hard it is, what other minerals are involved. Are there spots that have like big amalgamations of things that cause scratching? It's not even consistent, you know, from the top to bottom of the stone or left to right of the stone, and definitely not through the thickness of the stone. I guess the best thing that I can say about natural stones is try them, use them. You should always be able to test them if you can, and try and buy from people that are either testing them themselves or that you trust, you have a relationship with, because they're a very personal kind of experience and they all have their own qualities. In general, the lower in the strata that they are, the harder the stones are, and those harder stones will tend to be more appropriate for like woodworking tools and chisels and things like that. You could use them for knives. And the higher up things will tend to be a little bit softer, and those are the kinds of things that I prefer for knives, and I think you'll find in Japan that most people prefer for knives. They tend to like softer stones for knives in Japan. There are other kinds of stones that are like medium grit stones from different regions outside of Kyoto, and they all have their own properties as well. I should probably do like a much more in-depth video about that, but I think that would require me doing a little bit more planning and really outlining stuff so I make sure I get to everything in the meantime. But I guess in the meantime, I would check out JapaneseNaturalStones.com. It's my friend Maxim. He has a wiki page that goes over a lot about natural stones, and I think it's a pretty good resource. Tell him I say what's up when you see him or talk to him. So hopefully that helps and answers a little bit about natural stones. And with respect to the price, a lot of that comes down to size and rarity and has very little to do with performance. And so just keep that in mind as you're buying fancy stones. It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll work better. They might just be really rare or really huge or have a cool color or kind of aesthetic look to them. You know, if they have like the con pattern, like the tree ring pattern, or different kinds of visual appeals that people get into. So what was your favorite knife to create or draw or work with, sharpen? There have been a few over the years. I guess the thing that it's not like a fancy knife, but the thing that I'm really happy about is the Geshin Stainless 210 millimeter Wagyuto. And I'm happy about it because it's a really good knife and it's very inexpensive, and it fixed a lot of things that I didn't like about a lot of less expensive knives on the market in terms of how thin it gets, how much of a flat spot there is, how long the neck is, so you have space for your finger to fit underneath the neck of the knife. It's not fancy steel or anything like that, but I think it's a lot of fun. And then maybe some of the stuff that we've worked with in our Kochi line, the craftsman we work with in that line is really open to trying new things, and so we can always work with him and say like, hey, let's do this kind of shape, and I'll draw something out, or like, let's make it a little bit thinner the next time, or I need a little bit more taper towards the tip. A lot of our series aren't necessarily just like a one-off, like I drew some stuff out and sent it out to someone. Sometimes we start from things they're already making. Sometimes we start from a drawing on a piece of paper, but there's a constant evolution where every time that they make something, because they're handmade, we'll get it in and we'll see like, hey, how does this work? What do we want to change? Do we want to make it taller, less tall, longer, shorter? Do we need it to be thinner in the middle of the knife? I see that a lot. For example, a lot of the craftsmen tend to make things thicker in the middle section than I would like, and so we're always talking about, let's make that section a little bit thinner. But yeah, I guess the one that I'm most proud of isn't really a fancy one. It's just one that works well for a lot of people, and I'm happy that there's something out there that like regular line cooks or regular people at home can use and really enjoy, and that will work well for them in pretty much any situation they want to use it in. All right, let's see. I'm looking to move from working in the kitchen to sharpening knives. Can you give me any pointers in that direction? Stuff I should and shouldn't do? Are you hiring? I'm not hiring, sadly. We're a really tiny company. I think that it's a very tough business to get into and be financially successful because margins are really low. and until you get really good at sharpening, the speed at which you can sharpen things is pretty slow. And realistically, I think people should be charging more than they are for the work, but of course the market won't really support super high-end sharpening in any significant way. So I guess the biggest thing is if you're trying to do it, you need to learn how to be extremely efficient with your time and make sure that you're able to get through things as quickly and effectively as possible, focusing on effective burr removal, but also on making sure aesthetically that you're keeping things the way people want for the knives. People get really uptight about how things look, and so we spend a lot of time on making sure things look pretty before they leave here, because that's what people feel like they're paying for when they're paying for a professional to sharpen their knives. We limit the kinds of things we take on, not because we can't do things, but because it helps us control our workflow a little bit better and make sure that we're focusing on the things that we're best at. And so you may want to look into that. There's powered equipment that helps out a lot. So we have like a water wheel in the back. We also have a belt grinder and a buffer, which we don't use for sharpening, but are really effective for us for refinishing things. But yeah, I think that if you're getting into it seriously, those are all things that you probably want to look at. Make a business plan. Look and see how much your time is worth, how long it takes you to do things, and really think about that when you're thinking about your pricing. I don't think it's a particularly easy business to make a lot of money in, although it's fun and I think very satisfying. I really enjoy working with my hands, and I think a lot of people do. It's what draws people into woodworking or cooking professionally or all kinds of other jobs like that. So let's see. Here are a few. This guy has a bunch of questions for me. Why do 20K plus stones exist if they aren't really needed for 99% of people's knives? Why do $300,000 watches exist if most people will never be able to afford them? They're cool, I guess. There are definitely times that people want those kinds of things. There are like woodworking competitions where people are trying to use their planes to cut like the thinnest piece of wood that you've ever seen. And so those stones can be effective for that. They can be effective for straight razors, people that like shaving with straight razors. But also sometimes it's just fun to have stuff like that around. And it's not to say that you can't use them. It kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier on what level of bite or refinement makes sense for the kinds of tasks you're doing. Some people might like a 20,000 grit edge. For me, I think that it doesn't make any sense in the scope of what a kitchen knife is used for, but maybe it works well for polishing. Who knows? There's demand, and so people make it. And there are definitely some uses for it, just not for everyone. All right, stress the importance of overall geometry for a feel of sharpness versus just looking how thick the spine is. What kind of geometry will be sharper in practice? I think what you're talking about is cross-sectional geometry and where the knife is thick or thin. So like if something is thin at the spine but has very little taper from the spine to the edge, how is that going to cut versus something that has a more pronounced taper from the spine to the edge or is thinner behind the edge? I think that cross-sectional geometry is much more important than spine thickness, which is not to say you can ignore spine thickness. If something's like a centimeter thick at the spine, it's probably going to wedge in some stuff. So there's a range of things that's going to make sense, but thinness behind the edge seems to impact the overall experience of sharpening more than almost anything else, aside from actually just being a sharp knife. It dictates how knives move through food in a much more substantial way. Yeah, I guess that answers kind of what you're looking for. Thinner knives, both in the midsection and behind the edge, will feel sharper to people. Is it actually sharpness we're talking about? No. Sharpness is going to be how acute the edge is and how refined the edge is. And then I call it, I guess, perceived sharpness would be more what that cross-sectional geometry is about, how much resistance the knife requires to, or has as it moves through food, how much force is required as it moves through food. That's more a function of perceived sharpness, which is not actually real sharpness. But I think that kind of thinner cross-section in geometry makes a bigger difference in people's experience of what feels sharp than almost anything else I can think of. How does one thin a knife with a mild S-grind? Well, the bottom part of it, that convex part, is predominantly where the thinning is going to occur, and you're not going to be working so much with that concave part up top. And so you want to actually avoid doing that part as much as possible and just kind of moving things up with where that subtle convex area is. Yeah. If there's very significant work that needs to be done, you might actually end up having to regrind the knife and kind of recreate that subtle S grind as you go. But that's, I think, really technically complicated and beyond the abilities of many people. Not to say it's impossible. There's definitely people out there that are effective at doing that. But yeah, I think you're focusing more on the convex part on the bottom and moving where that begins up a little bit as you go through that thinning process. What do kato or shigefusa have over, say, kagekyo? I actually answered this recently. I want to say in the sharpening subreddit. There's a long post that I put up there that talks a lot more about that. So if you have a chance to check that out, I'll try and put a link for what thread that was in the description of the video. But I typed up, I think, a pretty comprehensive answer for that just the other day. What to look for in a knife from an unknown maker or smith while picking up stuff in Japan? That's tough because you can't see a heat treatment, and it's tough to know how people work. So the biggest thing that I would look at would be overall cross-sectional geometry, running my fingers from the spine towards the edge to feel how thick stuff is, and looking at the choil of the knife and how it tapers towards the tip. The overall fit and finish. Are there delamination areas that I need to pay attention to? Yeah, making sure like the core steel is centered, that the cladding doesn't come all the way down to the edge if it's a clad knife. The level of fit and finish overall. But as much as possible, I like to know the people that are making the things that I'm using. I know that's not always possible for people, but in my position where I'm selling stuff, I think it's really important. And that way I understand, I've been in their workshops and I understand how they work, how they heat treat stuff, how they grind stuff, whatever it might be. And I think that really gives me a lot more information on what I can expect from the knife. And so when I'm selling stuff, that's definitely what I'm thinking about as I talk with people about the knives. So if you're at a place where you can ask questions and learn more about that kind of stuff, try to do that, I guess. Over many sharpenings, my deba ended up with a pronounced convex curve in the blade road. How do I fix it? How do I prevent it? I think you're talking about where the blade road has now a very visibly convex grind. And this is what I was talking about earlier with respect to hamaguri edges, and that they're not supposed to be that pronounced. In this case, I think it's a lot of grinding and moving the shinogi line up and trying to flatten that whole thing out, not making it perfectly flat, but definitely flattening it out relative to how it was before. It's just expanding that area between the edge and the shinogi line, so there's more room for that bevel to be overall a little bit flatter than it was before. And as you go through sharpening, just making sure that you're not changing the angle so significantly when you sharpen the upper section and lower section of the blade road when you're doing hamaguri edges. They should be almost the same looking bevel all the way through as possible. So the difference is really small. So I think you're just going to sit there with the coarse stone for a while, trying to flatten things out a little bit more than they were before. All right, top few great knives for you, ones that impress you or are fun, something you reach for more often than not. Just personal thoughts on that. Of everything that I own, lots and lots of knives, I use my Geshin Ginga more than anything. And it's a really thin knife. I think the one that we have on our cutting board at home is white number 2. It's 240 millimeters with the Japanese style handle. That's my most used knife by a wide margin. I like really thin knives. So that's kind of fun. In terms of other things that impress me a lot, I guess Ryusen's knives, I don't think that I expected to be as impressed by them as I was when I went to visit them for the first time some years ago. But watching the way that they do stuff, and of course then using and sharpening things, I left really impressed with what they do with respect to how they go about heat treating and grinding and the level of fit and finish that they're able to achieve. I think it's really something fun. Then there's, I guess, kind of like one-off things. The Geshin Kagekyo in white number 1. The Wagyutos, those are kind of newer for us. Those are sick. Those are really sick. Why does my stone feel sticky on some knives? Depends on what kind of stone it is. I'm going to guess that it's a super muddy stone or maybe a resinoid-based stone, and maybe you just need to use a little bit more water when you're sharpening, but sometimes those resinoid-based stones do feel a little bit stickier, or muddy stones create a little bit of suction when you're sharpening, and it just kind of happens. So you can add some more water if you want. And that should help alleviate that a little bit more. If you're talking about the grip of stones, that's often more something you'll see with ceramic stones like vitrified or sintered stones, where they're just really aggressive and they feel very grippy, like track tires, as you're moving across the stone surface. What creates feedback in a stone? Why does my automo feel lifeless and my naniwa sings to me? It's a function of the binding agent, I think, more than anything else. But also the hardness of the stone. Harder stones tend to be less responsive. Softer stones tend to be a little bit more responsive. And as binding agents wear away, you get a lot of tactile feedback from that. So I think the binding agent and construction of the stone has a lot to do with it. The Atama is just an aluminum base with diamonds plated on a small plate, but essentially on the surface of the plate. There's no give. There's no room for anything to feel like anything. It just feels like abrasive scratching at things. Whereas with the other synthetic stones, as you're grinding away at them, the binding agent wears away, fresh abrasive is released. Sometimes they have some softness to them. There's just more going on. And I think that speaks a lot to why things have tactile feedback in that way. A lot of gyutos don't have much distal taper, say 3 millimeters to 1.5 millimeters to the tip. Why would I pick a knife that goes down to much less than that, like 0.5 millimeters is what he says. Not everyone wants to. Some people don't care if they have distal taper, but what distal taper provides is a little bit different balance or feeling of the knife, and also the tips end up being crazy thin, so they work really well for detail-oriented work in terms of like shallots, garlic, stuff like that. Let's see these last few. Why does it seem like there are very few lasers around and most people go for middle to workhorse level knives? I don't know, it's a function of what the market supports at the time. There used to be mostly lasers around and now there's mostly workhorses around, and I don't know what it's gonna look like in the future. There aren't a lot of people producing crazy thin knives, and I think that they are a little bit more time consuming to do. And also not everyone has that style that they like. Some people like making thicker knives and they think that works better. I think what's interesting is that a lot of the knife makers don't actually use knives as much. They make them, but they're not cooking with them quite as much. And I think that speaks a lot to some of the cross-sectional geometries that are a little bit more confusing. Yeah. Light knife with forward heavier balance or heavier knife with back balance, which would you pick for what kind of cutting? I pretty much always pick a knife with a forward heavy balance, whether it's light or heavy. And I like the forward heavy balance because the tip drops more naturally when I'm slicing stuff, but also the weight of the blade is positioned over the food when I'm cutting, so it does more of the work for me. Yeah. Modern alternatives to the popular KS, I don't know. I mean, just buy a KS if you like it. Thoughts on Yaki knives? Practical advantages? Not necessarily pragmatic. They often represent the pinnacle of what that craftsman is trying to achieve, but they require a lot more care and maintenance. They can be a lot more brittle, more finicky. They're carbon steel, and when they break, they break. They're not easy to repair. The idea is that they generally last a little bit longer in terms of edge as a function of the way they heat treat them. Is it significant for most people? Not really. So I think most people are buying them as a status symbol or as a function of their desire to get the best of what a craftsman can make, and that's often the case. And next time you're in Japan, maybe a video of how J-nats are mined. I don't think that I'll be able to do that. They're very secretive about that. And the last question also is about natural stones. I'm gonna see what I can do about making a video more on natural stones as we go on. I think that will take a lot more time. So sorry for rushing through these questions so quickly. I'm happy to do follow-ups if you guys have any other follow-up questions. But thanks so much for watching. Feel free to email me anytime at johnjon@japaneseknifeimports.com or check out our website at www.japaneseknifeimports.com. And thanks a lot. Have a great day, guys. See you later.